St Giles Files.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the St Giles Files. This week's object is an object that I've been thinking about speaking about for a few weeks. Well, actually, since we started, really. But I just couldn't quite think of how to address the object and then what the object would lead on to. So the object, to stop beating around the bush, is the Thistle Chapel. And the main reason that I'd avoided it in the past was because I just don't know enough about heraldry to do a podcast on it. I know a bit about heraldry, enough to give you a quick rundown of what it is and what it means, but I just didn't see the point in trying to do a half-cocked attempt at telling you about heraldry. And then I was having another idea as to what I could do for a whole episode, and then realised that the Thistle Chapel probably works quite nicely as the object. So what I'm going to talk about today is the usage of buildings, more specifically churches, and how that's changed and what we should take from that, I suppose. So what I'll do is I'll introduce the chapel, widen it out to them again as St Giles usage thing, and then churches in general. Now, there's no point of me giving you the chapter and verse history of St Giles, the Thistle Chapel, because first of all, you can read it in a lot of different places in a lot more detail than I could do it justice. And second, because I could spend the whole podcast giving you a history on the Thistle Chapel, but that's not really the reason for this. So what I'll do is I will give you the history that matters to the context for today, and then I think I'll probably tell you a couple of stories that are a bit funny about it, and then I'll move on. So, the bit that is important for the podcast today is, why is the Thistle Chapel at St Giles Cathedral? You'd be forgiven for just thinking they were synonymous. St Giles is the kind of the main church in Edinburgh and in Scotland. So when official government services happen, or official state services happen, they happen at St Giles. So you could be forgiven for thinking that's why the Thistle Chapel's there. And it kind of is, I suppose, but not necessarily that. So the Knights of the Order of the Thistle, we don't exactly know when they were officially originated. We can definitely say that James II and VII started the current order, if you will, but there may have been previous orders to that. But we're interested with James VII and II. And we're interested with him because he establishes the order at Holyrood Abbey. So Holyrood Abbey, for those of you who haven't been, is currently a ruin. But when James II and VII established the order at Holyrood Abbey, it was not a ruin. And he had it all decked out in the order of the Thistle regalia and carvings. And so it was a very fancy place, much like St George's at Windsor for the Order of the Garter. The tricky thing was, though, that James was suspected to be a bit of a Catholic, and he changed Holyrood Abbey into a Catholic abbey, expelled the Protestants, and he then installed the Thistle, the Order of the Thistle there. And so the Order of the Thistle was suspected also to be Catholic. So the Protestants weren't overly chuffed with that, and they sacked the abbey around 1688. Then the order fell into disuse, I suppose, or I can't think of a better way of saying that. Basically, it wasn't around until Queen Anne resurrected it, and then we've had the order since then. But the order didn't have a permanent home, because given that Holyrood Abbey was a ruin, the order kind of just moved around a little bit as to what suited it. And it wasn't until the Earl of Leven and Melville decided that the order needed a permanent home that he left money for Holyrood Abbey to be restored to its former glory and former home in Thistle Chapel. But then his sons, I believe, decided that it wouldn't be suitable. And St Giles had been spoken about as well before as being a permanent home for the order. But eventually it was decided it would be the home for the order. And so the chapel was built on the side around 1911. Now, that kind of meant a little bit of shuffling around at St Giles. There was the archway that you can exit the antechapel by is a medieval archway. It was shifted just a little bit to accommodate the chapel. And the reason I'm telling you about this archway is that the archway was shifted so there is an external exit so that the chapel can be used on its own. Now, I'll speak a little bit more about this later. But before I get too much involved in the chapel's uses, I just want to tell you one funny story about the construction of the chapel, and then we'll move on to the uses. The funny story is that so the chapel is for the Order of the Thistle, which is theoretically a uniquely Scottish order. It celebrates prominent people who have helped Scotland. And so it was decided by the architect Robert Lorimer that it should be pretty much constructed by Scots using Scots materials. And there was only one exception to this, which was the windows. Sorry, one exception to it being Scottish craftsmen, where the windows were to be designed and made by a fellow called Louis Davis, an English glazier. Now, as I've said in previous episodes, the management board of the cathedral were fairly strict and could turn things down for very arbitrary reasons. And so Louis Davis submitted his designs for all the stained glass, and there was one bit that the management board didn't like. They didn't like his St Andrew. They thought his St Andrew was too effeminate, and they wanted a more masculine St Andrew, so they turned down Louis Davis' original design. And they ended up getting another glazier who was Scottish, a guy called Douglas Strawn. They ended up getting him to do the design. And if you go into the Thistle Chapel, you'll see all the windows, except for the St Andrew, are done by Louis Davis. And they do have a more feminine quality. And then the St Andrew is now a big muscular fisherman. But apparently Louis Davis was fairly upset with this, and he sued the cathedral. And I think, well, from what I remember being told, he did win his case. But I think it's absolutely hilarious that we needed a really masculine St Andrew to kind of preside over the chapel, when actually Louis Davis figures are quite nice. Anyway, that was a side story on the Thistle Chapel. So it was designed by Robert Lorimer, built in 1911. That is the kind of the rough history that we need for this podcast. There are other histories on the website, so do go and click through to them. I'll put a link on the podcast page for histories of the Thistle Chapel. Right, so the bit that I want to talk about a little bit then is the uses of the Thistle Chapel. So I mentioned it has its own doorway, and that theoretically then is because whilst it is part of St Giles Cathedral, it's also not part of St Giles Cathedral. So when it was being built, the management board stipulated that St Giles shouldn't be affected in any material way. So if you've been to St Giles, you will notice that when you walk into the antechapel, it's quite a low ceiling, and that's because the window that's above in the main body of the cathedral, the light wasn't to be affected from that window, so the ceiling had to be low so the light could still enter that window. The idea is then that the order could use the chapel without actually having to unlock the cathedral. They could come in their own door and use the chapel whilst the big iron gates were still locked. To my knowledge, that has never happened. Every time that the order has requested to use the chapel, the cathedral's been open, mainly because I think everyone quite likes having the order there. Now, generally, the order use the chapel at least once a year for their service on St Andrew's Tide, which is the first Sunday after St Andrew's Day on the 30th of November. They will also use it once every 2 years, usually, pretty much on average, for a service with the Queen, whether that be to induct a new member into the order, or for the Queen's 90th birthday, say a few years ago it was used, or if it's just a summer service, which was supposed to happen this year, but unfortunately didn't. They will use it every couple of years. So they use it once or twice for their official business. But then the order can request the use of the chapel. So it isn't a case that it only gets used when there is one of the two services that I mentioned. So, for example, if you're a member of the order, you can have children baptised, you can have weddings, you can have, I suppose, funeral services. It's open to their use. And I think it's not too strict in that if you, let's say you're the grandparent of someone who is having a child, or that you're the parent of someone that's having a child, I think you could probably get them baptised there as well. I think it's pretty open. And somehow it wouldn't surprise me if one of the order said, "Oh, I've got a friend in town and I'd like to show them the chapel," and then possibly have a brief private chat. I could imagine that would be allowed. And the point of me speculating on what the knights can do in the chapel is to give you an idea that so it isn't just used for Thistle services, it's also used for services connected to the members of the Thistle. And so that's the theme of this week's episode is, what is the original purpose of a bricks and mortar area, and then what is its current purpose or its current usage? So the Thistle, designed for Order of the Thistle services, also used for members' services, not too dissimilar then, But St Giles itself, the cathedral, has had multiple different purposes. Whilst always being a church, let's be clear about that, it's always been a church, but it's served other purposes as well. So, for example, brief other things without too much explanation, it served as a police station at one point. Part of it did when it was sectioned off. It has served as a meeting hall for the General Assembly, and was supposed to serve more long term as a meeting hall for the General Assembly, but it was decided not to. Bits that I'd like to explore that I've mentioned previously: Haddo's Hole. So there was a small prison built onto the side of St Giles, and if you come into St Giles and you follow the route round, just before you leave and you go down the exit steps, if you will, there is a big brass plaque kind of covering what looks like an archway recess, which would have been exactly an archway recess. That would have been the entrance to a place called Haddo's Hole, which was a prison for a man called John Haddo, who was a Covenanter. Now they've removed the back part of the actual prison itself, but the doorway there would have been the doorway to Haddo's Hole. One of the more morbid uses of St Giles was its use as the storage place for the Maiden, which was essentially the execution device used for, well, executions obviously. It was stored in St Giles. And then if we go slightly further back in history to St Giles being a Catholic church, whilst this is linked to its business as being a church, it used to be the place where all business was conducted, because before you had written contracts, there were masses or kind of services would be said over a contract. So the two parties, let's say if it was the Merchants Guild, for example, would have had an altar in St Giles, and the merchants and whoever they were doing business with would come into the cathedral. They would go to the merchant's altar, which was in various places, the Eloy Isle first, and then moved around after that. But they would come to that altar. The priest or their designated priest would say a mass in which they would agree the terms of their contract, and that would be, in the eyes of God, their contract. So you wouldn't break that, obviously, because then bad things would happen to you. So St Giles has been used for doing business, really, which I suppose was pretty anti don't do business in the temple. But what I'm trying to say is that St Giles has been used, or was used, for a variety of different community events. Events that were both religious in nature and secular in nature, but had very little to do with actual Sunday morning or Sunday day worship. Now, I suppose what I'm questioning here is, at what point did that type of thing stop happening, and then has it started happening again recently? So was there a point at which churches possibly became more of a sacred space with which we couldn't use it for a prison, a court, storage of a guillotine, a place for agreeing contracts, those type of things, and it had to become just a place of worship? And when I've asked, was there a time, I think I actually mean, when was the time? Because I think we can all see that churches did become more just about the service and became less about their central nature in day-to-day community life. I mean, in St Giles, you can just see that because of the way that the restorations occur, in which the council in the 19th century were integral to every single restoration that happened in St Giles and often commissioned them. Now it's very much left to the church to look after itself. And I think the point of this, what it shows, is that St Giles stopped being used for secular events, and certainly events that maybe were religious in nature but not an actual service, and was confined to either its own services for its own congregation or worship services of national importance, whether that be kirking of the council or whether that be the Queen's 90th birthday in Scotland. These things, it was only used for services. And so what I'm asking is, when did we stop becoming the centre of all society, guillotine storage included, in services and such? And are we starting to change that back again, where we do become the centre of all society, where the Burn celebrations, for example, in January are at St Giles Cathedral, and other things like that? So I'll push the conversation out a little bit more to churches in general. Now, I think it'd be fair to say over the last 10 years, we've witnessed churches and cathedrals pushing the boundaries on what they can hold. Some examples might include concerts, music concerts. Manchester Cathedral had Elbow. We had the Museum of the Moon with Rachel Samani, amongst others. Laura Marling did a cathedrals tour a good few years ago now. And then we can move through things like Norwich's Helter Skelter, which seemed to be a real test of what churches should be used for. And other things like Manchester and Birmingham have had gin festivals. Now, whilst we could argue the main reason for these events is to improve the finances of the churches and cathedrals by finding innovative ways of interacting with the communities, I think the knock-on event is to make them more open and get them to consider the way that they do become central in all aspects of community life. I think there's a tricky tightrope to be walked in finding where that line is again. Whilst we could say that holding the guillotine probably wasn't acceptable for a church in the past, it happened. And I know in recent years St Giles has been offered to hold raves, which probably again wouldn't be appropriate. But whether our current sensibilities are too much that a church is a very sacred space and should not be used for anything other than worship, maybe that's too far the other way. And we should be open to using the church for modern community activities, whether that be a music event. A Helter Skelter, as the Dean of Norwich said, was just a good bit of fun. There was crazy golf, I think, somewhere down south as well. And whilst I can imagine how one's interaction with worship could be confused by those events happening in your place of worship, I would hope that the positive impact and underneath everything, the fun, bringing fun to a building such as a church has to be quite high on its agenda. Then I think that must be something good. And whilst it can be seen to be part of some sneaky agenda, get a Helter Skelter in, someone comes and has a whoosh down the slide and then suddenly finds God and they're in every Sunday for worship. No, I think that's good for you if you find worship as a result of that. But I think there is just the surface level of these buildings are for everyone and should be used as a fun thing for everyone. Now, it is for each building to find its way as to what that means, and I think a lot of buildings are doing that. St Giles has had a couple of these Burns festivals, which seem to be absolutely great ways of bringing people into the building. Manchester's gone down the concert avenue. Norwich seems to have gone down the Helter Skelter avenue. Sorry for the pun on gone down there. And to my mind, it brings these physically huge buildings, often in very prominent places, that possibly have been neglected Monday to Saturday in these communities or have been very exclusive in what they're used for, brings them back into the collective mind, and a question mark hangs over them in the sense of, we as members of the community, what can we do there? What are they putting on for us? And that can only be a good thing to bring beautiful architectural buildings back into the general public's consciousness. And so if my question was, did we lose these buildings a little bit? Yeah, I think we probably did. People would have walked past them and kind of ignored them a little bit, or not ignored them, but certainly had a very clear idea of what they did. Services on a Sunday morning or services throughout the week or choral stuff. That was that. I would hope that in the last 10 years, possibly driven by an income motive, that these buildings are now starting to open up again and pursue different ways of engaging the community and becoming once again the centre of the community's thinking about what's going on in the area. So perhaps my summary of this one-man discussion is that at one point churches were the centre of all society, be it secular or non-secular, and then they just became the centre of the religious society. But now perhaps we are seeing a change in which churches once again become the centre of both secular and non-secular society, whether that's via crazy golf, helter-skelters, or perhaps less contentious things like celebrating national poets by hanging a big moon from the ceiling. And whilst we're still finding our way, and without triggering too much of a philosophical discussion off the back of this, if there is a God, surely fun is part of its agenda, and seeing a kid whooshing down a slide in a holy building can't be the end of the world. Right, I think that'll do for today. Thanks. Bye-bye. The same postscript here as usual. As you can hear, I am still doing this on my own. And we're still out of action and still longer than we all anticipated. And St Giles is still topping up the extra 20% of our staff's furlough. But obviously we're still making no income from visitors whatsoever. So if you can help out and you have enjoyed the podcast, please do. Just head over to the website. It's really easy. There's loads of donate buttons everywhere. So it'd be much appreciated if you can help out. Okie doke, that's it then. Thanks, bye.